Today what we're talking about is the invention of nationalism. So we'll just start a little bit with just this question, what is nationalism? And part of the answer here is going to be there's no one single answer, because in fact this is a very broad idea or set of ideas or evolving set of ideas. This particular demonstration that's going on here with all the Catalan flags, a relatively recent outburst or enthusiasm of Catalan nationalism as the nation of Spain that has different, at least, ethnicities within it that have different language groups, from Castilian to Galician to Catalan to Basque. As one component of that, which is eastern portion of Spain, Catalonia, people there have voted several times that they would like to not be part of Spain. They would like to have their own Catalan nation, and so Spain has not liked that idea. And so Spain has done all kinds of things that anything it can do to stop Catalonia from being able to be its own country. And even though in some cases it seems like, given the fact that Spain is inside this sort of supranational alliance of the European Union, where Spain doesn't, for example, have a lot of things that used to go along with national identity, like one's own currency. It's now part of a shared currency, the euro, with the rest of the European Union members. And so therefore it seems like, well, how big a deal would it really be if different components of Spain were to be their own EU member states, as opposed to all being part of Spain? And Spain is an EU member state, and yet the EU, as an alliance of nation states, is actually not particularly sympathetic to the Catalonian argument. In fact, not sympathetic at all, because it's made up of these nation states, and the territorial integrity of them is the EU's concern. So there's an interesting, anyway, this is with us all the way back and to the present day in a lot of places. So one of the major influencers of nationalism at the beginning of the early part anyway of the 20th century is the US President Woodrow Wilson. When he is talking about the United States' intervention into the Great European War, what later becomes World War I, he has ideas. He writes out 14 points. This isn't one of the 14 points, but among the 14 points are ideas that are relating to nationalism and the idea that one of the major causes of World War I are emerging nation states whose national aspirations have been quashed by great powers. And so in response to that, Woodrow Wilson writes, "National aspirations must be respected. People may now be dominated and governed only by their own consent. Self-determination is not a mere phrase. It is an imperative principle of action." So the idea here is now Wilson, as a great power, what's ultimately becoming a superpower, is intervening in this conflict with at least a stated philosophical principle here that is recognizing nation states, which is to say nationalities, as having the right anyway to determine whether, you can draw a little border around them and say this is a nation and it should be able to be an independent nation, as opposed to a dependent nation within a broader multi-ethnic empire, as for example the Russian Empire was, the Ottoman Empire was, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was at the time. So, a couple problems though, with this idea, these principles going in. So this idea, President Wilson's idea of self-determination here, it's not his own idea, but anyway, his popularizing it and legitimizing it here. People here who share that ethnicity, but what constitutes shared ethnicity? So a lot of times we think, okay, well, language, maybe shared customs, is shared religion a necessary component when you're drawing a nation state? And so one of the issues is that prior to the development of a nation state, there may not be a standardized version of the language. So it's often mentioned, for example, that the largest nation that lacks statehood anywhere in the world right now are the Kurdish nation. But what's not often remembered or understood is that Kurdish is in fact actually a whole bunch of different dialects and the spectrum of languages, because the Kurds haven't had one national Kurdistan in which that could standardize the language, make it all one thing. And so in some cases then it's a complex question between should, is it one nation, or is it two nations, or is it multiple nations? Another example of that would be for a whole long time, is Bulgarian a different nation than Macedonian? There's a linguistic overlap. Now that Macedonia it's now called Northern Macedonia in order to placate the Greeks. But anyway, so Northern Macedonia is its own country, and it has standardized its own language differently than the dialect that is standardized as Bulgarian, and there's in fact a different standardized version of it in the Greek area. And so it may well be just originally one nation, but now it's in 3 different countries and it has 3 different linguistic standardizations, right? Shaheen.
I guess the same could be said for the Tuareg nations in northwest Africa, because just like the Kurds, they want to establish their own territory or a land for the Tuareg, but they themselves are composed of all these different tribes and affiliations.
Right.
And so it's like almost a modern idea that's been adopted by looking at other nations.
Yeah.
And then just like with Macedonia, you have India and Pakistan who have an overlap in their northern in India's northern territories and in Pakistan's eastern territories of language.
Yes.
But that now, because of nationalization and especially current very nationalistic governments, where the language is actually starting to evolve on separate tracts, even though it used to be shared.
Right. So this is another great example. So having gone here from the language to, in this particular case, so, okay, what about religion, right? And so between India and Pakistan, ultimately some of the customs were shared, and the language had been more shared, although, like you say, now the partitions happened, they're maybe consciously evolving separately, that religion ended up being the divide in what constituted the one nation as opposed to the other nation, and that's even though people might not have been that religious, so some of the people, right? And so that certainly we'll see is also true, for example, in the former Yugoslavia, where all that really separated in the language that used to be called Serbo-Croatian, the main difference between Serbian and Croatian is what alphabet maybe you're using to write it, and whether you're Orthodox or whether you're Catholic. And the third ethnicity in there now, Bosniak, is again, they all speak the same language, but now it's different because the Muslims have been left out of an ethnic religious divide in a country that had been communist for 50 years, and therefore nobody has technically supposedly religious the whole time anyway, and yet that still erupted as the divider. So is it religion? In some cases, yes, right? And anyway, if you have all of these, there are people. They have one of those qualities, whatever it is. Language is especially a big one. And then they have national aspirations, as Wilson says. They should be able to hold a referendum on whether or not they want independence. But unfortunately, the cure of the problem of these national aspirations that was at the root of World War I, the outbreak of World War I, that actually spread the idea and maybe the contagion of the idea of nationalism well beyond where it had already been. And that has just spread, and as we've even had more recent examples here, across to Asia, to India, and Africa, other places. And so, for example, we have here, we have a multi-ethnic empire, Austro-Hungary. We have a particular ethnic group inside it, let's say the Slovenes. Maybe they live in a pretty defined area, and it's easy to draw a circle around them, but it may well be that they are intertwined with all of the other ethnicities, and it gets quite complicated, right? So just to look at that background that Wilson is dealing with. I don't know if you can see this map well, but essentially this is Europe, the boundaries prior to the beginning of World War I. So there have already emerged, sort of these great nation states in the West that are quite powerful. Germany is just reunified, and Germany has just unified. All the little countries have all come together to form a nation state, other than the Austrians, who are a German people, who only are this little component of this larger multi-ethnic empire, Austria-Hungary. And meanwhile, as the multi-ethnic empire of the Ottoman Turks is declining and retreating out of its European possessions, all of these smaller countries have getting their independence, and so the Serbs have national aspirations that are being kind of quashed by the Austrians, who have lots of Serb-like people living in their empire, right? So there are people who speak a very similar language in Bosnia and Croatia that is all across here. And the Austrians, therefore, are very, 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 very nervous about any of these kind of nationalities and the eve of this war. So in fact, actually, we'll go to the next map so we can see it. So using those same boundaries, if we look at just the kind of linguistic divide, the Austrians here are speaking, a kind of German on a continuity of the rest of the German dialects, but across the national boundary. So it's a national boundary, so it's their own little differences in how they say it. But and then there are Germans that are kind of spread all around everywhere, but in small pockets. And the other central nationality of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Hungarians, but then there are just large other nationalities, the Croatians, the Slovenes, the Czechs, the Slovaks, different Romanians and people that are within this multi-ethnic empire, and Serbs who also see themselves as being everywhere where there are essentially Orthodox Serbo-Croatian speakers would like to create a greater Serbia or some other, maybe even a pan-Slavic state where all of the related peoples from the Russians are all kind of brought together into a pan-national alliance kind of thing. So anyway, you can see it's quite complicated even if you were trying to draw new boundaries when there's so much intermixing, right, of all the territory. That Wilson, good intentions aside, is causing potentially a lot of future problems, or a lot of future problems result. So after the treaty gets going, after Versailles, after the war, lots of these different countries, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is broken up. Lots of these different countries then emerge. The Serbs are subsumed within Yugoslavia, but they dominate it, so they end up kind of liking, I think, that result as being on that side. Poland is reconstituted after a whole long time of being ruled by the Austrians, the Germans, and the Russians. Meanwhile, Russia has gone into its kind of Soviet crisis, which is outside of the bounds of what I'm going to be able to talk about today. But anyway, in terms of nationalism. But anyway, we can kind of see that this has started to, what we'd seen before here in Western Europe, this has started to make its way across Europe, but there's more to go, right? So, for example, as Poland had been partitioned among the Germans, the Russians, and the Austrians, and now, but it's a nationality that had already had a strong emerging sense of itself. It now, after Versailles, after the end of World War I, the Poles achieve their national aspirations, but in so doing, they now also, they have to fight it out to get it, but they now also extend their boundaries of Greater Poland to include other peoples, the Belarusians, the Ukrainians, who now are having their own emerging national aspirations. Now that they say, well, wait a second, why can't we, Ukraine, be free? Why can't we be our own country? And then why shouldn't, for example, all of this Ukrainian yellow area be in Ukraine, or this green Belarusian area be in Belarus? And the Lithuanians are also sitting around thinking, boy, we'd really like Vilnius to be our capital, this kind of thing. And so anyway, so that Poland emerges, but is immediately emerging into this national nationalist contest with now, as nationalism has rolled forward further east, they have to deal with the consequences of that. So, what are the borders of your nation state? So as the idea of nationalism spread eastward, then it encounters peoples that are way more mixed, as we've just seen on the maps, linguistically, than those in England or France, so places that had the national idea much earlier. There are lots of places, like in a city like Vilnius we were talking about, which ultimately ends up being the capital of Lithuania after another bunch of fighting and things that happen, where the people in the city may well have been, let's say, split between ethnically Polish and ethnically Jewish, however, if Jewish is an ethnicity, whereas everybody in the whole countryside might have been Lithuanian. And so how then, what do you do under those circumstances, right? So where do you draw those borders if everybody's allowed, according to Wilson, to have that national aspiration? If you're able to have a vote and decide whether you should be free, where do you decide to draw the boundary to see who gets to vote? I mean, it'll affect the vote. Yeah, there's a question.
As long as a state is ruled under monarch or a strict dictatorship, we don't see such nationalist aspirations or people getting divided amongst the linguistic or regional sentiments. But the moment they come across democratic ideas or they experience the taste of democracy, suddenly their regional aspirations or the linguistic the linguistic feelings come into place. So do you think democracy gives rise to such nationalism?
So yeah, it's a very interesting question, because when it's starting, and we'll see when we go back to France, it is completely intertwined with some of these liberal ideas of liberal constitution, and the idea of spread of democracy, and different ideas of freedom are intertwined with it all. And yet, what we can kind of see as it's erupting its way across Europe at this point, it doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with that. So, for example, when Germany has its national aspirations and unifies, all the little German states are unified under Prussia, it doesn't, for example, become a free democracy. There is it's still a fairly solid monarchy with a federal parliament that is. A lot of cases, it's been able to be very authoritarian, right? And so it doesn't necessarily have to go hand in hand. And to your point about whether once we get to a monarch, the problem for the Austrian emperor, I guess, is not that all of these different nations, the Croatians, the Serbs that are under the Austrians, the Bosniaks, the Croats, and the Slovaks and the Czechs. It's not for example that all of those didn't have a king. They did. They had the Habsburg emperor, but at a certain point it wasn't enough. They wanted, they had national aspirations. Certainly the Hungarians. The Hungarians had kind of a double interest, which is they didn't like being subordinated to the Austrians at all, but they were very interested in subordinating everybody around them to Hungarians. So anyway, so it's a complicated thing. So we have here, for example, I have these pictures. These are Austrian girls who are celebrating the union of Austria with Germany. So after the destruction of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austria is left as a little tiny country that had once ruled an empire. Now they're seeing themselves as, well, what's the difference between us and other Germans? And so there was a percentage anyway of the populace that wanted to unify with Germany and to create a greater German nation state. There was a lot of concern within Europe not to do that, because Germany already, population-wise, had become the biggest country within Europe and had the most industrial capacity, and so therefore, specifically France didn't want it to get any bigger, because the French had no capacity to prevent a German invasion in the case it would come, which they weren't able to when it did, right? And then, of course, in the same question, in terms of that expanded German nation that the Austrians joined, are religious minorities a part of your nation state? So we talked about that in terms of the partition of India, where the national boundaries are identified here because some people are Indians who are Muslim and some people are Indians who are Hindu or Sikh, but maybe the Sikhs want to have their own state too. Khalistan in addition to the Hindustan and the Pakistan. What about minorities who, let's say, are ethnically German? They speak German as their first language. They had always been citizens, but now their citizenship is revoked by a oppressive government that decides, no, you aren't part of our nation, and ultimately, in this particular case, obviously the most horrific case, systematically then murdered 6 million. Okay. So it's not like it stopped there. So the more, World War II is in some ways, World War I maybe came about because of some sorting out of national aspirations. Now, at the end of World War II, one of the attempted solutions is an end to all that mixing. So where there had been Germans spread all around here, for example, 12 million Germans in different places, they're all moved here in the largest population transfer in history. Meanwhile, all of those Poles that were living in that portion of Poland that they didn't have the majority of, those guys are all moved to what's now Poland. And likewise, there's just a bunch of what we maybe now call ethnic cleansing, where everybody is forced to move everywhere to try to create these nation states that are more like what had existed in the West prior to World War I. And so we mentioned anyway that even when World War II had ended and there was the entire Cold War period of time, and for example, this is Yugoslavia. In Yugoslavia, where there had been artificial national identity created, the Southern Slavs, nevertheless, even though officially everybody was communist, even though there's therefore very little difference between a Serb and a Croat and a Bosniak, since the primary difference between any of them, they all speak essentially the same language and have been living in the same kind of communist country with each other for however many 50 years. Nevertheless, they divide in the 1990s on nationalisms that are religiously based, right? So the Serbs are Orthodox, the Croatians are Catholic, the Bosniaks are Muslim, and because they had been, especially in Bosnia, so intertwined and indeed intermarried and cosmopolitan together, the ultimate, so as we see kind of the split, so initially Yugoslavia, then rump Yugoslavia with an independent Croatia, an independent Slovenia, an independent Fyrom, former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, now called Northern Macedonia. Then splitting off from that, Bosnia, but the Serbs being very concerned that there's an entire large Serbian, actually it's over here on these sides, there's a large Serbian population, there's an additional civil war that goes on to try to split up Bosnia into these different a Serb republic and a Croat Muslim federation, and so it's essentially still in kind of two pieces within this little republic at this point still. And then finally, the war that happens in Kosovo, where the different Albanians who form the majority within the province of Kosovo, the Serbian province of Kosovo, and then finally the Montenegrins, who are essentially a Serbian people, or very close anyway language-wise because they're Orthodox and they speak very similar language to the Serbs. Nevertheless, they're tired of being dictated to by Belgrade too, and so essentially Serbia is all by itself at the end of that, right? So, and just because, to a certain point, people had really thought after the kind of nationalist European suicides, essentially, of the first two world wars, it had really kind of been believed that anything short of some sort of World War III scenario where Europe gets totally obliterated, that wars had been essentially a thing of the past in Europe, that wasn't going to happen in countries that were so developed and able to trade and all this kind of thing. And yet as we saw all through the 90s and beyond, there were all these wars erupted, and there were all of these killings and all that sort of thing. Okay, so what is nationalism? Another answer is, after we've just kind of gone through this sort of bleak review, is Einstein's answer, which is, he calls it an infantile disease, the measles of mankind. I think that is, on the one hand, it's a very negative assessment, but maybe also an optimistic assessment, maybe too optimistic, because it does seem like it's a more chronic disease than one that people, unless he's really thinking about us in 1,000 years from now, but we still haven't recovered from childhood measles necessarily yet. So there was a lot more of this disease from after which he said this, yeah.
Chickenpox and shingles.
So shingles. Yeah, so it's just like now we all have shingles, right? So unfortunately. Okay. So I've gone through some of the ugly side, but there's also, in terms of nationalism, it depends on your vantage sometimes. And so there's also, depending on your vantage, been some maybe positive developments that have come through nationalism. So obviously the Holocaust is pretty inarguable, but on the other side then, leaders like Gandhi harnessed the power of nationalism, among other things, to accomplish goals like ending European imperialism and European colonialism, so centuries of British rule in India. And so through generally peaceful means in terms of, it was not like there wasn't violence in the course of the different demonstrations in terms of the repression on the part of the imperial government to try to put these down. Nevertheless, sort of an amazing outcome where the British at a certain point had no response that they could muster in the wake of India's national awakening. And this is, as an example, also led to decolonization all over the place, as at the end of World War II, almost all of Africa is owned either by the British, or the French, or South Africans, and the Portuguese also here and there, with just a handful of, they were even occupied by the Italians during the war, but anyway, a handful of just independent countries at that point, to today, when everywhere except for Western Sahara has been decolonized. Yeah.
I just wanted to point out that nationalism in Europe versus nationalism in the rest of the colonized world is very different, because in Europe you have this idea of nationalism emerging as a sense of shared identity between people who have decided upon self-determination.
Yes.
But in Africa and in Asia and in other parts of the world, it's the areas that reached for self-determination were areas that had belonged to some colonial power.
Right.
So there were artificial constructs
Right.
that included people of different linguistic and cultural and ethnic groups, and that's partly a reason for the genocide in Rwanda.
Right. Yeah, so a very, very good point. And if we were to do this same thing, and which we have that map, if I were to have one of these, I wish I did, as the next slide. If I were to, though, have a map of language families here in Africa, it would be like that one that I gave in Europe, in Eastern Europe at the time of World War I, where you have all of these mixtures that are cross boundaries, right? So the British have drawn this kind of boundary with the Portuguese at some point or other, but the underlying African ethnic group, straddles these boundaries, right? And that's just true all over the place. And so these are what the colonial powers, they all got together and had a big conference at the end of the 19th century. They more or less controlled the coasts, and they just drew everything inland, in order to, and made things like a Caprivi strip in order to try to get there, to the rivers and everything else, as they were scrambling to try to seize control, essentially, of all of the manpower, people power, and especially natural resources of Africa to exploit them for their colonial empires. Anyway, that all collapsed. There are other new problems in the post-colonial world, but anyway, that imperialism in any event collapsed after the Second World War. Nevertheless, once the genie of nationalism was unbottled, it nevertheless, you can't put it back in, right? And so as these sort of national aspirations occurred, what had originally been envisioned as a united India ultimately is partitioned into what became three countries, originally a Pakistan that was divided by a large Hindu majority India, to Muslim majority Pakistans, now Pakistan and Bangladesh. And then just amazing untold suffering and death as refugees from both sides fled to not be on the wrong side of the relatively arbitrary lines that the British were kind of drawing as they were leaving. So, yeah, so no, this is not a small deal by any sense. And so this is, despite the fact that, when India is envisioned its national identity here, it's meant to be a unified, multi-religious state with orange, as part of the flag for Hindu and green for Muslims. So in other words, the Muslims are fully included, white for everybody else, and the spinning wheel as a symbol here for the whole. Nevertheless, as this is continued, initially the Congress Party, which had aspired to those values, was in charge, but now that has passed to the Hindu Nationalist Party, and so this continues to roll forward. Yeah, there's a comment. And so again, once the genie's out of the bottle, it's like you can't cork that back in, and unfortunately this is going to continue to sort itself out in our life, throughout our lifetimes, no doubt. Okay, so I called this lecture Nationalism as an Invention, right? So Invention of Nationalism, which is showing my partisan bent a little bit, but I think this is also the majority view now. Maybe a century ago, it wouldn't have been. So in a century ago, there may have been it might have been more frequent to assert, as maybe Wilson would have, that there have always been nations, and it is only their aspirations and an understanding of themselves that awaken, and that nationhood is in fact a natural condition of people and peoples. So we're calling this, it's been called anyway, nationalism here, the ID force, the main idea, the primary thing, the thing that we've all been fighting and killing each other about ever since it got invented as an idea. Anyway, in the political, cultural, economic life of Western Europe since the late 18th century, but then, as we've seen, spreading all the way to the present day, right now in places like India. So the idea generally, it's understood to have emerged in revolutionary France and spread from there. And like I say, other people have argued whether or not this is an invention, but I'm arguing that it is, and I'll explain why. So, haven't there always been nations? So we talked about Cleopatra last week, for example, and so Alexandria, right, as her capital, Ptolemaic Alexandria. So we said last week, when we were going through the history of the Ptolemies, in 3 centuries of their rule, the Ptolemies were a Macedonian or Greek-speaking dynasty, and Cleopatra, after all those Ptolemies and other pharaohs who named Cleopatra and Beatrice and Arsinoe, all of them, she's the first one to learn the Egyptian language, right, in that whole time. So her capital, even though most of the people, maybe the 7 million people or so that live in Egypt, they all speak Egyptian, and they've had a fairly coherent ethnic identity for thousands of years. Nevertheless, this Greek city, cosmopolitan city, Alexandria, founded by Alexander, is a mixture of Greeks, which is to say people, on the one hand, from Greek cities proper, but then also people like the Macedonians who have become Greek speakers. In other words, people who have assimilated Greek language and customs and now are just lumped in with Greeks. Specifically, then, these are Greeks who are polytheists or pagans, people who are worshiping either the Greek gods or native Asian gods that have been moved, transposed, or the native Egyptian gods, but through, what am I trying to say? I'm trying to think of this word here. Syncretism, yeah, that's the word. So syncretism, they have been syncretized, so now we have new gods like Serapis, who is essentially Zeus transported to Egypt and become a fertility god with a traditional Egyptian basket on his head in order to represent fertility, and now he's the consort or the husband of Isis. And so that's not quite Zeus, but not quite not Zeus, right? So anyway, those kind of Greeks. And then there's also then Jews, but they're not Jews who speak Hebrew. They've been in Egypt for centuries. They used to, maybe their ancestors spoke Egyptian. Now they all are speaking Greek, and in a lot of cases their Hebrew isn't very good. And so even when we hear the scholars, they're not very good at parsing out the Hebrew underlying their scriptures, and indeed they access their scriptures in Greek, the Septuagint Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. So they have all those, and then they will have the native Egyptians, who are largely, by the ones that are in Alexandria anyway, the elite of the Egyptians or the servant class, and either way they have to have some bilingualism with the Greeks, since the Greeks are not sitting around learning Egyptian. So anyway, so there's this cosmopolitan but especially Greek city there, and for nearly then, from that time, actually a few centuries before that, when the Assyrians first conquered Egypt, for nearly 2,500 years, there really were no ethnic Egyptians who rule Egypt, and the majority of the population ultimately became Muslim, and they ultimately also went from speaking Egyptian to speaking Arabic, or Egyptian Arabic. And so that all is happening throughout a time period without, for example, having somebody from your ethnicity or your nation, if it were a nation, ruling the nation, right? So there are both lots and lots of conquests, and lots of assimilation, even from religion, when the majority goes from being polytheist or pagan to being Christian to being Muslim, and also a language shift. So there's definitely in antiquity what we may call tribalism, and that is, I'm going to argue, is different from what people experience with modern nationalism in a bunch of important ways. So, for example, we know, maybe if you know Jewish history or read the Bible, there is a sense that ancient Israelites have, where they have a very strong sense of their identity as being separate from all of the peoples around them. And certainly that's true in a literary sense, because what we're doing here is we're seeing this identity that is held by the elite class, right? So the people who are actually writing, who are just a very tiny percentage of overall people throughout all of human history until modern times, right? And so these are the nobles and the priests of ancient Judah, and they have, that a strong enough identity that even when their Iron Age kingdom of Jerusalem falls to the Babylonians, and the elite leaders are taken off to Babylon, or some of the other ones flee to Egypt and become the ancestors of that Egyptian diaspora that we saw in Alexandria. Their identity at this point is strong enough, their tribal identity or their sense of themselves, that survives that conquest, them ceasing to be in charge of a kingdom. However, the people who aren't in the elite, the people who stayed, and that's the overwhelming majority of the population, only the nobles will be carted off anywhere. You always leave the 90+% of the population that are in any particular place when you conquer it are the peasant class that are working the land, and you need them to work the land for you. And so one of the things that ancient empires would do is bring a bunch of troublesome people from wherever they're from. They would settle them in the place that's newly conquered. They take a bunch of the conquered people and move them to the other place, so that people no longer have their localized sense and are essentially dependent on the imperial power to provide for them to have a livelihood. They're there, and they don't want all their nearby neighbors to just massacre them, and so they're kind of committed to the empire that has brought them to this place. So that's true for the bulk of the population. That's going to be true in all pre-modern times. But even the elites, so those elite members of the Judean court who had originally been speaking Hebrew, when they go to Babylon, they adopt this what becomes the international language of the Fertile Crescent, the Aramaic, and they immediately start, speaking Aramaic, and it doesn't take 2 generations. They're only there for 80 years or something like that. It's even the descendant of the last Judean king, so the last king of Jerusalem, the Davidic king himself, is named Zerubbabel, which is a Babylonian name, which means guy born in Babylon. So it's not even. So they're quite assimilated by the time they go back, and so that. The level of that kind of assimilation, even though the religion is held onto and that a separate identity is held onto, including marrying patterns, nevertheless, in the Jewish diaspora, generally speaking, throughout all of history, the Jews locally learn the vernacular language or some kind of variation of it. So Yiddish is almost entirely German, and similarly the Spanish-related language in Spain and so forth, the Arabic ones. And so there'll be, Maimonides, for example, composes almost all of his, he's from Andalusia, which is to say Muslim or Arabic Spain. He composes almost all of his treatises in Arabic, which is his native language. He does that, he's a scholar, so he does know Hebrew, and he composes an important one in Hebrew as well. But that's largely, so if we're trying to look at overall ethnicity being language and customs and things like that, even though this is an ancient people that have a very strong identity, they're not even maintaining language, for example, in their daily lives as their main, for most of them anyway, outside of scholars. Another group that we're very aware of that has a strong sense of identity are the Greeks. And so just like the ancient Jews who have a word for, let's say, us, and a word for all of you, and so, we translate that using the Latin word Gentiles, or Goyim, I guess, is the Hebrew. The Greeks similarly have whereas they have multiple words for Greek. Greek isn't actually their word for Greek. That's the Roman word for Greek. But they also have like a word for everybody else, which is the barbarians, right? And whereas throughout a lot of its history, Judaism, the Jews, were endogamous, which is to say they marry other Jews where possible, and so therefore have maintained themselves relatively separately, although not always. There's intermarriage. There's even conversions in antiquity. Nevertheless, by contrast, Hellenism, or in other words, the idea of spreading Greekness, was actually a pretty big on the agenda items of the ancient Greeks, especially once Alexander rolled forth and decided to conquer the Persian Empire. So the goal then was assimilating everybody into not so much a Greek nation, but a cosmopolitan identity that is ethnically biased for Greek. So getting everybody to adopt Greek customs, but we're also syncretizing them, so they're ancient gods and things like that. We just understand, well, your god is just Zeus, or your god is just Aphrodite, or something like that. And as we sort of blur those distinctions and create kind of a universal cosmopolitan culture that is based on Greek philosophy and customs. And so then anyway, a sense of Greek then spread across the kind of Eastern Mediterranean without actually being a nationalism, I'll say. And so for me, when I was a little kid, and I would look at the back of the Bible, and so there's all these maps and things like that, and so you'd see a map of Judea at the time of Jesus, for example. And I always look at this thing, and it was always so weird politically, because you'd think, well, how on earth, and you maybe never did this, but anyway, I always looked at maps when I was a kid, and so how are this grouping here called the Decapolis, and how is that one political unit of just these 10 Greek cities that are just kind of interspersed with the whole rest of the kingdom? And it's because the whole kingdom here is a client of the Roman Empire, so the Romans are essentially controlling the whole thing, and before them, the Seleucids, the Hellenistic monarchs. And what the idea of it is different cities have been refounded as or founded as Greek metropolises where the people have adopted Greek customs in order to get certain tax rights and other kinds of advantages. And so what you end up having are that situation that we saw before with Vilnius in the modern times, where you have, let's say, a Greek city here like Sebasta, which is just Greek for Augusta. So it's founded as a Greek city in honor of the Emperor Augustus, which is just immediately just a couple hours walk from Nazareth, which is a Jewish village, right? And so those will just be completely interspersed with each other. So this ancient Greek identity here then is civic. So you're identifying as a Sebastan, I'm from that city, and then otherwise cosmopolitan as opposed to a nation state here of Greece, at least at this point. So that path continues on for the Romans. So the Romans inherited a lot from the Greeks, or rather plundered or pillaged and grabbed a hold of and added to them, including this idea that everybody else is a barbarian. The Greeks were pretty clear at first that the Romans are barbarians, but at a certain point they got that beat out of them by the Romans, and so the Romans got to be, kind of invited, to the Olympics and things like that. And so the Romans then ultimately merged, and we get this idea of Greco-Roman, right? So the idea that the Greeks are brought into the Roman Empire, and the Romans are eventually persuade Greeks that they're part of the in-group. And so then for much of the Western world, but also the Near East, the idea Romanitas, the idea of Romanness, although it begins as a civic identity, so initially Rome and being a Roman is just being from the town, right, from the city of Rome. But that spreads, as the Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire spreads its dominion across for what for the Romans is the known world, other than Persia and the barbarian areas. And so eventually that spreads very broadly, and even the idea of being Roman and Romanness outlives the idea of empire. But it's not initially, in any sense, a national identity. So I'll mention here, so Roman citizenship, as it expands, that helped Romanization roll forward all throughout the Roman Empire, although Latin really only spread in the West because in the East, the empire was bilingual and it just simply continued to Hellenize as people learned Greek. And that continued forward until we get to the 3rd century, when everybody who's a male citizen, everybody who's a free man in the Roman Empire becomes a citizen in 212. And so, anyway, just to get out of antiquity and back into the present, even though there is this idea of Romanness, it's not even necessarily an ethnic identity. So in the East, people who are considering themselves Roman, for example, are speaking Greek, right? And so, although we call those Eastern Romans, we call them Byzantines by our own convention, they call themselves Romaioi, which is to say Greek for Roman, right? So they're speaking Greek, but they're very clear that they're the Romans. And in fact, so we have here, this is kind of, you can see this is what's now Turkey, right? And Constantinople, so Istanbul, Bulgaria, and now what's now Greece proper. So when the Turks come in and conquer this heartland had been a Greek-speaking heartland of the Roman Empire, they themselves think of this land as being the land of Rome, and the sultans there are called the Sultans of Rome, which is they're the Roman sultans, And likewise, when we have Rumi, who's a very famous poet who we've had lectures on, that just means the Roman, right? So it's kind of an interesting reality. But anyway, so Romanness continues, and later, even when we get into the when the national aspirations start coming in the 20th century and things like that, in 19th and 20th centuries, this area up here gets called Romania, and it's called that to this day. This area here was called Rumelia, So again, it's all based on Rome. Okay, so how did this happen? So we'll just rotate back here. I want to talk a little bit about how languages transmit and change. So without any migration of Greeks, so when before, under the Persians, when this had all been conquered by the Persian Empire, before the Greeks conquer Anatolia, there had been all of these, we might call nationalities, or whether ethnic or at least language groups. So people who are speaking Lydian, people who are speaking Phrygian, people who are speaking Galatian, which initially is a language that's called Gaul there because it's related, it's a Celtic language, so it's related to Gallic and Welsh and all those languages, right? So Gauls, Cappadocian, everything like that. So over the course of being then assimilated into the Roman Empire, they don't all learn Latin, they all learn Greek. And so by the time we get to the Middle Ages, that whole area then is Greek-speaking, and they also all convert to Christianity. And so it becomes essentially the heartland of Romania in the ancient medieval sense, not Romania now, but anyway, the area that the Greeks call the land of the Romans, right? So what happens? So the Turkification, how does it all become Turkish? Well, it's not that all of that, an entire 7 million, or however many, but 4 million in this case. So there's 4 million Greek speakers in Anatolia when, after this very decisive battle in the 11th century, Manzikert, when the East Roman Empire, when the Byzantines are defeated by the Seljuk Turks, it's not that, and now the Turks overrun that, what had been the heartland of the Eastern Roman Empire. It's not like, they massacre every single one of the Greek-speaking people that live there. In fact, millions of them are there. The elites flee maybe to Constantinople, or they stay and work with the Seljuks and slowly assimilate. And so the bulk of the people, of course, are just peasants, again, always, and so they continue to be there, and it's maybe no different except for they have less taxes, actually, because the Byzantines had a pretty Byzantine tax structure, and they're known for that, right? And so anyway, it turns out when you have a bunch of migrant marauders, kind of Bedouin marauders who are running around, it's not always as stable, but you often have less taxes than a stable ancient empire. So what ends up happening then is that there may have been, let's say, 4 million people who had been Greek-speaking, and Christian, and they slowly assimilate for social reasons, for economic reasons, for political reasons, for, let's say, religious reasons of actual true conversions, as the Muslims who are in Turkey develop Sufism and other kinds of ways to popularize Islam, and people just convert from their own free will. Nevertheless, we could say that population is still very, very mixed. It's like by the time you get to World War I, and it's only with the foundation of modern Turkey and the wars that happen with Armenia and everything that happened there, and also with the Greeks, that you really start to get things to be less mixed. And even now, of course, as we know, there's a huge component of the population in the southeastern Turkey that are Kurdish, whose national aspirations have been quashed for a century here. And it's still problematic, right? Okay, so let's just look at a little chart here of how some of this works, because sometimes you think, well, this is always going to go a particular way, right? So we have here in what we now think of as Turkey, it's like Anatolia. We said at a certain point it had gone from being all kinds of different languages and pagan to, at a certain point, being entirely Greek-speaking and Christian, right? And you get this conquest by a Turkic-speaking Muslim elite, but minority, so very tiny, so maybe a couple 100,000 people out of 4 million. And slowly over time, that group is able to assimilate the whole population to the point where you get to a Turkic-speaking Muslim nation, right? That doesn't always happen that way, though, just because you maybe think, so let's say, if we look at Lombardy. So Lombardy, what we now call Lombardy after the Lombards, northern Italy, what the Romans originally had called Gaul on this side of the Alps, because when the Romans got there were a bunch of Gauls living there. But anyway, this had been, by the breakup of the Western Roman Empire, people who are speaking a Romance language. They're speaking a vernacular form of Latin, common form of Latin, and they're all Christians. They get conquered by a Germanic-speaking pagan people, the Lombards, who pretty quickly convert to Christianity. They pretty quickly lose all of their German language, and they start speaking essentially the local Latin-derived Romance language, what ultimately becomes Lombard Italian, right? So Italian. And so that is the opposite. So essentially now in this particular case, the elite adopt the customs and religion of the people that they conquered, right? So that's one example. Another one is, so for example, in England. So England had also been part of the Roman Empire. So this wouldn't be called England back then. It would have been called Britain. They are therefore speaking Latin, or at least a lot of them are. Some of them are speaking, especially in the fringes and different things, they're speaking Celtic languages. But in the English part, the richer part, they're largely speaking a version of Latin. They get invaded by Anglo-Saxon pagans. And at the end of that conquest, the Romans are the ones that are assimilated and become Germanic-speaking pagans. And so it's not just, if we're trying to figure out, well, is it you have a strong religion, or is it if you're a more sophisticated conqueror or something like that? It's not always the case, right? So specifically, for example, then when in a similar example, in Normandy, what had been Gaul, Armorica, they had again have this Romance-speaking people, so Old French. Then they are conquered by the Norse, the Normans. The Normans give up being pagans. They give up their Norwegian-style language or Danish-style language, anyway, Old Norse, and they become speaking Norman French, and they become Christians, right? And they pretty quickly forget how to use boats even. So anyway, so they assimilate very fast, right? And then they conquer England, which they'd left it as German-speaking pagans, but they got converted to Christianity. So now in the meantime, they're Christians. Romance-speaking Christians, Normans, conquer them. And this is yet another option of what can happen. You get this hybrid language, English, right, which has got its structure of German, but all of our vocabulary is from the French and everything like that. And then, and not pagan, I should say Christian. Oh, well. Okay, so we did the West, we did the East in terms of people maintaining that idea of Romanness. What happens in the West that creates this ground that creates the idea of nationalism in France, right? So I've said before, when we had a lecture before on maps lying, if we go back to 1100 and we see these things, we see nation states, so we see France, we see the Holy Roman Empire here in England and things like that, and so that just automatically makes you think that this is all French people in here. But in fact, there were, up until modern times, just a complete spectrum of competing local and regional sovereign centers as the language from the vernacular here in French is going down to that Catalan language and everywhere in between where every local polity has their own dialect. And we talked about that at the beginning with the Kurds, for example. So zooming in, that's just kind of showing that within the people here in Aquitaine and Toulouse are speaking a different kind of French than the people in the northern French, right? So just at the time, as these were all emerging, Dante noted, for example, that concerning these emerging Romance languages, some of them say "ok" when they're trying to say the word yes. In other words, their word yes is "ok." Others say "si," and still others say "boil" or "we." That's what it's going to be now. And so, therefore, it's emerging into have different vernacular languages, but it's not like it's just one. All Languedoc and Languedoc. That's actually the other way around, Languedoc. Rather, each one of these little places has its own little vernacular and dialect, right? And so before there's a nation state, all these customs are on a spectrum and they're different place by place by place. Okay, and so if we take then, in my little hypothetical kingdom here of Avantia, or island, I'm sorry, it's not a kingdom, island of Avantia, if we see anyway that there are these present day, these linguistic divides where there's three languages on Avantia. So we have the Norvantian speakers, the Asantic speakers, and the Atlundish speakers, right? And these guys are also here. To get to that place, that's where it is now, where there's nation states. These are nation states and they have borders and they have flags, all of those things that we're very familiar with now. But how did they, get there? And so what might have happened if we go back in time is that, in fact, in this language is on that spectrum that I'm talking about, Norvantian with Isantic, and there would have been, it would have been quite similar, but at a certain point, there's something that's kind of in between here. So there's this spectrum of how the language works, and then there's this other language, Atland, that was the language of all the merchants and then all the cities all around the whole island, right? And so then that was the way the boundaries worked, and over time, because of that, when the nation states emerged, anyway, that's how we got to the place we're at. There's an alternative political history that could have happened just as easily, right? And so instead of having those be the boundaries, if it had just been these two, it had been divided into two. If that had happened, it might have been that we would have just had the two different languages and two different nation states, right? And so anyway, what I'm suggesting here is that even though we are sitting around and we think of nation states as being very solid, very fixed, very different from each other, and that nationalism is somehow very, very real, any number of other things could have happened to get us into a very different circumstance, right? And so there could have been any number of things that would have led to having a Norman Empire here, is what this guy's map is showing, or a Bello-Prussia, a Pamplonian Empire, Portugal, Galicia, any number of other nation states that could have emerged with quite different languages than the ones that we have right now, right? And so, although we have then people who are promoting the ideas of nationalism in the 19th and 20th centuries, connect language, customs, and religion with race, historically it was always easier to convert a population to the conqueror's language and religion than it was to just displace an existing people. So largely speaking, just like in that example in Turkey, it's not that all of the people in Turkey ever got killed and by all the Turks or something like that. And likewise, even so in the Anglo-Saxon conquest, way more Britons were still all there than was ever given credit for, so as we do the genetics for it. So most of the conquerors, again, are elites. They don't have any desire to displace conquered peasants because the peasants represent wealth to them. They need the peasants to farm and all that kind of stuff. And indeed, they don't have any particular identity with their own peasants. And so this is one of the reasons why in all of antiquity, there really isn't nationalism, because nationalism is when the elites start to decide that we're all one nation together with the peasants, right? And the peasants start to awaken to the idea of a national identity. So why did it emerge in France as opposed to any other place? So we had that idea of Romanness, of empire-ness, and that is maintained through the Middle Ages, and there are two great heirs of that. The two great heirs are the emperor, the Roman emperor, it's often called the Holy Roman Emperor, and the popes, right? And the popes ultimately, and the Roman emperors ultimately have a fight with each other. The popes destroy the imperial house, the Hohenstaufens, and ultimately the empire gets divided up into all these kind of different little tiny states, which ultimately are mostly sovereign all unto themselves at a certain point, and are therefore very weak relative to the neighboring nation states that start to emerge on either side. And this is one of the reasons why Germany began this nationalist period feeling very downtrodden. It has a lot more to history too. But in any event, this idea of Romanness, this idea of Rome, of empire, in other words, something transnational, something unifying us all together, gets wiped out as the two main heirs kill each other or suicide on each other, kind of. And so instead what happens is, out of these tiny, go back a little bit, out of this very tiny area that the kings of France, for example, had to them, very little power, they are able to concentrate, though, on controlling that and exploiting it very well, and slowly over time, as they bring more and more land into their domain. This is pretty much, if you talked about France in the Middle Ages, they really would mean this little, you could be a king of the French, but the Ile-de-France was really what they would mean often if they're going to go from Normandy to France and things like that. And so slowly then, these national kings on the French model here and also England, are able to build their power at the time that the bigger kings, the emperor and the pope, are destroying this supranational identity. So why did it emerge again in France? One of the things that ended up happening in the big fight that the kings of England had with the kings of France, when this thing, what we call the 100 Years' War and its precursors, when it started, the kings of England spoke Norman French and then later Angevin French. And they were major landowners in France, and there was really hardly any difference between them and the counts of any of these other counts. So the counts of Dukes of Aquitaine, the Dukes of Burgundy, or any of these other Guienne, Gascony, in other words, other French lords. But after 100 years of duking it out with the French, when the English would get everybody up in their boats and they'd come across the sea and essentially have a scorched earth policy of trying to just beat the French weren't able to respond at a certain point, so they just hunkered down in their castles and let the English do whatever they want until they would go home. And so once that's actually a very successful strategy. And so once that had been going on for enough time, at the end of it, the French had a sense of Frenchness, and they had a sense that we're the people that are being invaded by these guys, as opposed to it being a civil war amongst French elites, right? So, okay, why is it in France? So fast forwarding here to the next phase. Now the French, having kicked the English out and having the kings having assumed control over most of what constitutes France, we get to modern times, and Spain suddenly emerges as this kind of superpower when the last gasp of empire, the Austrians, who are the German emperors, and the Spanish monarchy are dynastically joined in Charles V, and so there's this great potential of an empire where he also owns the entire New World. So France suddenly is in this situation where they're surrounded on all sides by this very powerful guy. And so the French, again, now, even though we're entering into this time period when everybody is fighting over religion, the wars of religion, and so this emperor spends almost all of his time beating up Protestants in northern Germany, the French, generally speaking, though, again, are deciding that the thing for them is not this bigger picture of whether they're mostly Catholic, and so you'd think that they might be on the side of the Catholics. But in fact, because of their own existential needs to be fighting against this superpower that's all around them, they generally speaking always side with the Protestants, and indeed they actually side with the Turks most of the time too. So they have an alliance with the Ottomans, the Muslims, against who are invading Vienna, because anything to take pressure off of them from their fight with the emperor. So again, this is setting, I think, stage for why France is thinking of France as a nation state as opposed to any of these other ideals. And so then another final emergence is that through this age of reason, through the 18th century, the Enlightenment, thinkers in France and the UK upended all kinds of traditions. So everything up to and including just the idea that now they believe in, for example, things like progress through scientific innovation and all these kind of things. In the past, people had always assumed that the world was decaying. But now there's a new optimism that is coming, that if we just simply focus on reason, that we're going to be able to think everything through and reason everything out. And so one of the reasons why nationalism emerges in France is as a reaction to this maybe overly sterile and cerebral, dispassionate understanding of how we're viewing the whole world. Some of these incredibly meaningful to all kinds of people, traditions that have narrative behind them, that have sensation and emotion. There is a reaction in this new romantic era that follows, where we are now telling those passionate stories, where a passion becomes vitally important. And so this reaction is also hand in hand with nationalism and its emergence here in France. And so then from it emerging in this economic condition where all of France is able to be mobilized, then we have a very weird circumstance where Napoleon is essentially going around and conquering everywhere, but spreading revolutionary fervor. So revolutionary ideas of we were overthrowing our old ancient regimes and all these bad traditions and things like that. And now we're going to do that to you, by conquering you. And so every one of these regimes that Napoleon rolls over top of is always in danger, because there's going to be potential for locals who are interested in these kind of ideals that have been promoted by the French Republic, as they're now maybe seeing their own awakenings of different national awakenings. And ironically then for France, one of the biggest ones that hits that is when Napoleon conquers these 1,000 little German states and brings them all together for the very first time in centuries into a confederacy of the Rhine that is ruled by the French, but fairly quickly after Napoleon's defeat starts having national aspirations of its own. So I want to talk, so those are kind of like I think some of these roots. Why ancient ideas of tribalism are very different from where we are with modernity. And so I just want to now, and I know that there's some frustration that we didn't only do the modern stuff. This ended up being, like I say, a bigger topic than I was ready for, and I wanted to show some of this background, but we'll have further discussions in the future. I wanted to talk a little bit about then some of the nationalism that we're hitting like right now, and how some of it's pretty crazy or doesn't have a lot of historical thought in it behind it. And so one of the things that we've seen that's a major crisis recently is Brexit, as a referendum held in Britain. The UK, as you know, decided to leave this transnational or multinational body of the European Union for what I think is somewhat confused reasons. So Britain, we saw in our lecture before that we did on Gothic revival that in some sense there was the reason why is that built in Gothic. That's not a medieval building, but it's built in the Gothic style as part of that Romantic era. It's built smack dab in the middle of the Romantic era. If it had been built a few centuries before, when St. Paul's Cathedral was built after the fire of London, that's a beautiful neoclassical building. And so obviously there was this idea of building everything in that kind of Romanesque or Renaissance Roman style. Now there's this romantic idea that as English people, we're looking back to that national story, this Anglo-Saxon story maybe, and we want to revive, build the Houses of Parliament not as a Roman palace the way the Americans did, but as a good English Gothic style. And so I've read before when people are doing English history, I was kind of amazed that 1066 was kind of portrayed in this kid's story as a foreign invasion. And so it's, I think, a kind of a schizophrenic identity that the English have to have when they're thinking about trying to craft a national story. So are the Normans, when they cross the channel from France, French speakers, is that a foreign invasion from our perspective now, let's say if we're Britons today? Should the English of the present root for King Harold Godwinson and all of the Anglo-Saxons against these French colonizers that are going to be operating England for this time? Or, conversely, are all English people actually heirs of both the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons? And so if we're rooting against the Normans and we're only thinking on the Anglo-Saxon side, by contrast, is King Arthur an English hero then? So, Arthur obviously is not so much a historical figure, but anyway, is a story that is told by Geoffrey of Monmouth. Arthur is a British or a Celtic king who actually is fighting against the Anglo-Saxon invaders. So Geoffrey, if we look at him as a Norman cleric born in Wales, who may have been attempting to give the Normans a sense that, well, these Welsh people are actually should be lionized because of our connection to them. So that seemed, in that case, it's the Welsh making common cause with the Norman invaders against the intervening Anglo-Saxon lords. And so if we are telling kind of an Anglo-Saxon national story, can we, as Anglo-Saxon English people, would we be able to claim Arthur as a hero in creating this national story? The reality is that Britain has been has had multiple different identities, and for the last several centuries has been constructing national identities. You're probably pretty aware of how the Union Jack is a combination of the flag of England, flag of Scotland, or into the Union flag, and then not really Irish, but the Irish weren't really using this, but meant to be using this to create the current Union Jack. And this is really one of the history's most successful brand designs. Even so, in 2014, almost half of the residents of Scotland voted to end this 307-year union. And if they had gotten to vote in the reverse order, so Brexit, since the Scots probably majority wanted to stay in Europe, if they'd had the referendum after, they might have actually voted it through. Within the British Isles, at a certain point, as you say, Ireland had also been incorporated into the United Kingdom, all of Ireland, and now the Republic of Ireland is out and been independent for about a century. And interestingly, though, that even though Wales doesn't make it onto the flag and has been fully incorporated, let's say, into England so much longer, nevertheless, one of the interesting things that has happened in the last couple centuries is a massive resurgence of the Welsh language. So lots and lots more people speak Welsh as their first language than either the Gaelic in either Scotland or in Ireland, actually, even though Ireland is independent.
A lot of Wales is also bilingual, so wherever you go, you will see signs in Welsh and in English.
So Wales is a remarkable success story in terms of the recovery. I mean, they'd always been speaking Welsh, but way more people speak Welsh as proportion than had for a little while anyway. So anyway, that's also interesting. So within the UK, though, Scottish identity is actually constructed. And so if we were to even go back, the medieval Kingdom of Scotland, it's a royal union of Scots or Gaels, so depending on how we're going to call them. And so those are originally, Scots originally it's a word for Ireland, what now we call Ireland. But the Scots moved, the conquering ones moved to what's now Scotland. And then there was also the Britons or Picts, which is also a Celtic people, but British Celts, so they were all different in a way from the Irish or Scots Celts. And then Germanic Northumbrian Angles, so the lowlanders all the way up through Edinburgh is actually part of a Germanic Northumbrian Angle kingdom. And then, of course, the Norsemen that are on all the islands as the Norwegians took over Orkney and all those other places, right? So as we pretty famously know, things like Celts and the Tartans are kind of famously modern innovations, or at least in the form that they are now, the short kilt and the particular patterns and things like that. So Braveheart's pretty bad history, actually, although sometimes fun movie. So it doesn't necessarily, nationalism or national identities don't necessarily have to involve one ethnic group or everybody having to be one particular religion. As Elizabeth said, as close as everybody all is to homogeny, you can still want to grind that down more as you persecute anybody for nonconformity, up to, as we've seen, the Holocaust. On the other hand, it's completely possible to have a multi-ethnic state that construct a successful identity. So a big example is Switzerland, which emerged as independent, or at least not recognized, but anyway, it was functionally independent, de facto independent all the way back to the Central Middle Ages, and has not had a tendency or a decision or a policy of assimilation. And so there are four languages: the German language, German Swiss being the strongest component, but the French Swiss being a very substantial, and then of course Italian and Romansh Swiss, right? And that we certainly also have had very recently anyway, in Canada. And so initially there was all kinds of pressure in Canada under British rule and independence later, or it's a spectrum of independence for Canada, in terms of discrimination against certainly First Nations peoples, but Francophone speakers up through the more recent multicultural policies, which have been in favor of celebrating that diversity instead of trying to get everybody to assimilate to some kind of Anglo Protestant if possible, but anyway, Catholic if have to be. So that brings us to where kind of as we're wrapping up here. where we are too with Trump and this white nationalism that reared its ugly head once again this weekend with the major mass, one of them yet another mass shooting, and the various attached to white nationalist manifestos and things like that in the United States. Again, this identity of even being white is just as artificial as these other constructed identities, only they're even more recent and more variable. So Thomas Nast it's a 19th century cartoon here of anti-Irish people. So Irish people drawn here as being monkeys, but there's a wealth of all of these. Initially for white identity in the United States in the 19th century, that required that you were Protestant. And so as large numbers of Catholics immigrated to the U.S., they were not viewed as being white. So it is only over time and with assimilation and an expansion of what people who are identifying themselves as white start to decide, well, what constitutes this artificial identity. And so what has ended up happening is different Europeans from Celtic or Southern and Eastern European backgrounds have started to make it in the bounds. There's questions, but Jewish people, there's some people who don't think so in this kind of white policing. Same thing, more lighter-skinned people of Spanish or Latin American descent as they because again, it's not a race, as they start assimilating into it. So it's a variable of what even constitutes this this constructed ethnicity, and part of the issue is, and one of the reasons why, although it was predicted at the beginning of the 21st century that if the Republicans continued to become more and more of a white identity party, as they have, that they wouldn't be demographically able to compete in national elections. That one of the major issues that has changed that is as Hispanic or Americans have more and more have assimilated, some portion of them have identified as white, and so therefore that has pushed back when that change can happen, as has all kinds of other electoral rigmarole and ceasing to compete on in any kind of a fair way electorally. Anyway, so that's kind of where I feel like this has happened, where there's this again artificial identity. So there's an alternative to that for the United States. So although that stream of a white ethnicity, artificial identity as being at the heart of the American story has certainly been there as the ugly underside throughout all of American history. Nevertheless, the actual national identity, I think, that the U.S. has been founded on, going back to its foundation myth of the Founding Fathers and the Constitution, is one of ideas, right? And so liberal democracy, accepting immigrants, ultimately an idea that you would be able to bring in different people and give those values and ideas, as opposed to it being a racially distinct group, and that's how you'd police the borders. So that's my take anyway on the invention of nationalism. I actually think we have a lot to discuss. So, yes. Brian, yeah.
John, I just wonder your thoughts on the idea that Western politicians today have rejected the notion of nationalism in terms of conquest or the subjugation of other people, but they have plucked from the notion of nationalism patriotism, loyalty to the state or the nation above all else, as part of their platform of electability.
Okay. So you say Western politicians?
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, we definitely part of the post World War II stability or relative stability of the planet has been that the boundaries as they had been kind of drawn have to be fairly fixed, and that when people have attempted to kind of challenge that has largely often been resisted. And so, for example, all of these very weird arbitrary boundaries that got drawn in the Middle East are fairly fixed in terms of like Iraq trying to invade Kuwait or something like that. Although in other cases, those national aspirations, obviously are still existing. China is very, very clear that it's wants to absorb Taiwan, for example. It's not allowed, as far as they're concerned, for Taiwan to not be part of China. In terms of Western leaders, I mean, if Russia's Western, obviously the Russians are not done. The annexation of Crimea was fairly recent. I mean, it's not recognized broadly, but it's de facto happened. And so Putin and the Russians are busily trying to annex anywhere that has a large Russian population, so Ossetia and all these kind of Abkhazia and all those kind of places. But I think that in general, the rest of the, like you say, the rest of the West isn't, Germans can't start talking about past lost German lands. They're just never going to do that. And so any kind of change of national boundaries, like you say, is off limits. Nevertheless, like you say, there's all kinds of things out of the romantic story of nationalism, the patriotism, the flags, everything like that. I mean, an example is, Trump is just constantly going over to flags and hugging them and just kissing the flag and all those things. So, it's literally wrapping yourself up in the flag almost. And so
he wouldn't call it white nationalism.
No.
He would call it American patriotism.
Right.
Loyalty to the state, America first.
Right.
He wouldn't even use the term nationalism.
No, they're not using the term nationalism, certainly not. But it doesn't mean that it's not necessarily an appeal. It's certainly, I think, still an appeal to white nationalism, or at least white nationalists in the U.S. have found it appealing.
So first of all, thank you so much for this talk, because it was just really interesting overall. I guess I'll just kind of try to keep it quick, because I'm sure there's a lot of other questions. This is a very hot topic right now.
Yes.
So just one quick example, because you were talking about, I guess, what I found really interesting, kind of an inversion of this Wilsonian model of, okay, you have ethnic groups, and you need sovereign states for those ethnic groups. But to the contrary, sometimes a sovereign state actually creates this group or makes it more homogenous.
Yes.
And it's not just something historic, but even really recently, I'm a bit of a junkie regarding, I guess, like Eastern European politics. And in 2006, when Montenegro became independent, I think it was something like only a quarter of people in that country actually checked off on the census identify as Montenegrin.
Oh, yeah.
But then after independence, it was something like 75%, just to show how, I guess, flexible identity can be, and how it can kind of go the other way.
Right. That's a great example.
Yeah, I guess my other two quick comments are, one, I wonder to know if you can just talk a bit more about borders in general. I feel like a lot of the issues regarding nationalism and, kind of we see this European issues in Europe regarding trying to draw these borders, but there's ethnic groups here and ethnic groups there. Whereas from my understanding, the way we understand borders and how sovereignty works is really only something from the 1600s with the Peace of Westphalia. Before that, borders were much more porous.
Right.
And just the second thing I really want to quickly touch on is also, I guess, kind of looking at ethnicity not from a very essentialized view, but seeing how ethnic conflicts emerge, not as in, oh, you have two ethnic groups, conflict's inevitable, there you go, nothing we can do. But I was wondering if you could also talk about, I guess, power and economics and how that fits in, because, very often, especially like as someone who's studied a lot regarding the Yugoslav wars, we kind of take it for granted, obviously Serbs and Croats always hated each other. Right. That's just how it was always. But I think there's actually a lot of scholarly research to show that conflict very much was, one of opportunists from a very small fringe of the population who wanted to use that in order to gain their own powers and economic resources. So. Yeah.
And so that last example is, I think, quite a good one. So I said I've done map making, and so one of the bunch of series of maps that I've done is for books on the Yugoslav War, and so I was in one by illustrated one by Bob Donia, Bosnia and Herzegovina: Tradition Betrayed, And so his contention really was that that this was crazy, I mean, more or less, because the people had developed a strong, even as Yugoslav had been a perfectly, had been quite a strong constructed identity, but one where the people within, in Bosnia especially, were quite integrated with each other. And so I illustrated another book by wonderful author Borka Tijanović, I think, and so her parents are, one is a Serb and one's a Croat and she's a Bosnian, and so in other words, it was very the families were very assimilated and everything like that, integrated, and so it was very hard to rend them apart. And so drawing, especially even the kind of especially crazy border within Bosnia between the Republika Srpska and the Croat and Bosnian Federation was pretty crazy. And so that was the third part. The second part was borders in general. So one of the things that I tried to show with my hypothetical map, that kind of showed before there were borders, there was this spectrum of the language across that whole island. And that when the border appeared, that's when it started to have a centralizing tendency in the language. Suddenly, everybody who's in the border of what becomes Italy has to kind of learn Tuscan Italian, even if they have some kind of local Calabrian Italian or something like that as their natural language. And if there had been a border, if the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies had stayed separate, they'd all be down there be speaking Neapolitan Italian instead of anybody, and just the Northerners would be speaking Tuscan. So in that sense, there were none of these borders, like you say, until we get to, and there were certain defensible frontiers, let's say, that the Romans had. But largely speaking, it was the reason why the entire nation of the Ostrogoths could get across the imperial frontier and still be a kingdom as it kind of rolls around the entire Roman Empire is because there really isn't any borders, and what's happening is that there are structures that are much more human, as it depends on who, it's not, there's no police even, but anyway, as the military that's defending your leader's capacity to do justice or exact taxes or anything like that can frankly move around, from Italy to Gaul or to wherever they end up, right? And so the Vandals end up in Tunisia. And so in that same way, those borders really didn't exist. And so as a result, when we start drawing the borders, that's, in places that had been multi-ethnic societies. So I think that goes back to your first point, and which is often in a multi-ethnic empire, like the Ottomans or something like that, there may well have been like a group that's kind of the elite group, and that's just kind of understood. So the Ottoman Turks maybe are the leader group, but within that understanding, then there still could be quite otherwise good interactions. So Ercan is from his ancestors are from actually not even that long ago. Grandparents or something like that are from Thessalonica, which had been a cosmopolitan city that was whatever, a third Jewish, a third Greek, a third Turkish, and that kind of thing. And there was that is a condition that existed for centuries. So it's not that there's never been conflicts when those kind of things are happening, but there's conflict everywhere, right? So there was a lot of capacity for these multi-ethnic societies to have just existed throughout time until this change happened with the invention of nationalism. So Valerie.
Well, it seems that nationalism is a very hot topic right now because of the enormous resistance to large flows of immigration into whether Europe or the U.S., especially the southern U.S., from points south of there. And it seems to be that nationalism is being conflated with a kind of a nativism.
Yes.
That resists immigration, especially large flows of immigration, and these nativist reactions have occurred, especially in the U.S. in the past. And in the past, it was more a case of a different ethnicity or religion, except with, let's say, the Chinese and the head tax. But now it's a question of race. And so would you speak to that this may be an anti-immigrant, especially immigrants of a different race, backlash, whether in Europe or in the U.S., and that's being conflated with some kind of nationalistic discourse or narrative.
Yeah, I agree. So I think that I think the most brilliant episode of The Simpsons that ever happened, was that they had a bear had come into town, and in order to create a bear patrol that had jets and things like that were preventing bears from ever affecting Springfield again, the town spent all of this money. And so now they had to, in order to fight, to pay for it all, they had to raise taxes. And so Mayor Quimby, was able to stand up and say, people of Springfield, your taxes are too high because of illegal immigrants, and that we can, and we'll get rid of them all. Yeah, it's not the bears. No, it's not about the bears. We've lost the bears entirely. So it's just flagrant scapegoating that just the rest of the different members of the town, Apu and groundskeeper Willie and everybody who's an immigrant, is going to be kicked out of the city because by the Springfield's referendum. And so it was just, how do politicians just immediately push off to nativism in order to just flagrantly scapegoat away from structural problems that nobody wants to pay taxes, and everybody wants more spending. And so between those two things, you have to find a way to push it all off. And so unfortunately, for example, in terms of Brexit, one of the just easy gimmies for all local national politicians for the past half century is to say, people of Belgium, everything that's happened. The Belgians are maybe the bad example. Anyway, anybody else, people of Greece, the entire time, everything that has happened to you is because of the EU, and that may be true for Greece. But anyway, but for England, so so everything that's happened that's bad in UK. And we can just always blame bureaucrats in Brussels. And so as a result of that, the popularity of things like the EU, just goes down natively as the people are scapegoated. And then in the same way, in terms of that's the transnational side of it, but then on the other side of it, as structural economic changes are happening even in the developed world, where labor is becoming less and less valuable, where there's being more and more income inequality. It's harder and harder, even despite even though it has always been the solution, has always supposedly been to have more and more education. Now the population is so and so educated to beyond what ever has happened in all of human history, and yet all of the people in North America that were churning off this PhD conveyor belt are all immediately not having any capacity to have any more job than the Amazon warehouse. And so why is that happening? Illegal immigrants among you. They've taken all your jobs, they've suppressed everything. And so it's easier always to make that kind of scapegoating, going all the way back as we did the lecture on the Crusades. The Crusader Knights, it's easier to get the Jews that are right next to you than it is to march all the way to the Levant to fight Muslims, right? And easier too, less dangerous, and all that with all that incumbent horror. So I definitely think that this, unfortunately, because it's so much easier to do this kind of scapegoating, that is one of the things that continuously fuels nativism, and that's been. I think that's been Trump's Twitter formula from day one when he emerged on the national scene. So because that ground was very fertile already, he was able to just stoke it with Obama birtherism that elevated him into the national conversation, and from there, to his escalator, the Mexicans that are coming, they're sending us the rapists, or sending the Americans the rapists, and that kind of a thing, to just this last week, where it's been all of the people of color who are in Congress should go back to some black country or whatever, when they're all from, with the exception of one from my home state, Minnesota, who was born outside, actually born in Somalia, but anyway, they're all from obviously the U.S.
Yeah, like Queens.
Yeah, right, exactly. Go back to Queens.
Yeah.
So,
where do you think Trump is from?
Exactly.
I'm thinking of a man now dead who once got up in Quaker meeting for worship, and he said, "We don't need leaders." Well, I think what he meant mostly was we don't always need the officially designated leaders. We can produce leaders of our own, which is true, but we do need leaders. Most of us, most of the time, need leaders in various activities and various aspects of our lives. And if we don't have good ones, we'll get bad ones. And imagine what might have happened to Yugoslavia if instead of somebody like Slobodan Milosevic, they had had somebody like Seretse Khama, who was the first president of Botswana. Botswana is a multi-ethnic state, but they're all I forget what the word is. They're all citizens of Botswana now, and whatever is. I'm also reminded of a couple of forgotten bits of American history. One is that at the time of the American Revolution, there were some who wanted to invade Quebec and liberate it from the dominance of, was it Britain at that point? I think it was still,
the British.
But their idea of liberation also included liberating them from the Catholic Church.
Right.
They weren't going to have that.
Yeah.
And the other is a bit of Texas history. It was founded as a slave empire to grow cotton. It was, of course, then it was a section of Mexico. Mexico had abolished slavery in 1821 and 29. They made an exception for Texas. And then in 1845, the bottom fell out of the market for cotton, and Texas was in bad shape economically. The Brits offered to bail them out, but this would have meant them becoming a British colony, and Britain had abolished slavery.
Yeah.
So it was a choice between staying more or less independent, but not having slaves, or becoming an American state and keeping slavery, and we know what they did.
Yeah. And the U.S. also, in the Compromise of 1850, paid for all their debt. So how nice for them. So they, like you say, and one before that, So for Quebec, one of the things that has kind of gotten lost and forgotten probably in a lot of historical memory, maybe some of the people in Quebec remember, but for First Nations people too, one of the things that was often true was that the Crown has an interest in more than its let's say Anglo subjects, whereas the Anglo subjects on the ground are very interested in seizing all the Indian lands and things like that. The Crown is actually kind of interested in having First Nations allies and also maybe even adhering to some principles, although they'll always sell you out, to make a compromise with the people who, when they have to. And so in that sense, one of the reasons why Quebec, didn't get more assimilated than it did was that there was they had allies in a sense of the actual monarchy, as opposed to the local Anglo people that were more anti-Catholic on the ground, and same thing also like always with the Indians. So the Indians, one of the whole points also of the American Revolution was that the British Crown had issued a proclamation line that the Anglo settlement could only go to the edge of the Appalachian Mountains, and the rest would be a permanent Indian territory. Well, none of the local Anglo settlers in what became the United States were interested in that idea, and so they all ran across, even though it was illegal, ran across the mountains, or a lot of them did. Yes? Okay.
So you nicely show here very comprehensively that the idea of nationalism is arbitrary. It could be anywhere. There could be any identity. I think though it misses a kind of bigger question here, and is nationalism good for you?
Yes.
And I think if you look at a group of people who say yes, it's good for me. We need to be empathetic to this group of people. For example, you will imagine somebody in a little town in Detroit or something.
Yeah.
Right. So for that person, imagine he's working in a dishwasher factory.
Yes.
So that person who loses his job, 90s is very good, highest standard of living. Coming to 2008, they lose everything. For this group of people, they find the idea of nationalism not just as a scapegoat. It's not an irrational choice. It's not something somebody's playing with their emotional state. I think they're making a very rational choice. They say, who's supporting me, who's providing for me, who's having my back is actually somebody with nationalism who says, I do not let Chinese take our job, get to build washing machines, right? You would see the impact of this in Canada with like that person could have been Canadian, right? In Detroit, just the law could have been changed. They could have, rather than celebrating July 4th, they could have celebrated Long Live the Queen, right?
Yeah.
Now you see this in Canada, things like dairy farmers. They get a huge advantage by the nationalistic, trade barriers. You see the high standard of livings for dairy farmers in Canada versus the dairy farmers in the U.S. just 50 kilometers down. They lose that because their government is not nationalistic. And they let there's no system. It's a competition. Is a corporations and whatnot. So I think we need to be. I think this lecture is very interesting, but I think more interesting is this question of how we create a system where nationalism is good for you. How we evolve nationalism into an idea that is good. Rather than dangerous, like a patriotism and fascism.
Yeah, I mean, and so I guess I've come down kind of negatively throughout a lot of this because I've used a bunch of negative examples. Although I did try to say that, so for example, that the ending of imperialism as a counterexample, and so not always, so this is a force. I think I agree with you that this is, as with so many ideas and so many powers and forces and things like that, that they can be used for good or ill. And so it doesn't have to be channeled in such a way that it has to be nativist and racist and anti-immigrant or xenophobic or all those kind of things. It's possible to have, I think that, so if we're saying it's an arbitrary or let's say artificial or constructed identity that could have gone any other different ways, the Canadian identity that has been built since the creating of the flag, which happened in the 60s, and the creating of the official bilingual policy that is extended to a multiculturalism policy, has created for Canadians, I think, a identity story or a national story, which is we're the country of diversity, we're the country that celebrates diversity, and so that doesn't have to have evolved into that. That was a choice in a way, or it was constructed that way. And that's a kind of a nationalism, even though it's not an ethnic nationalism or racial nationalism, that is using from my perspective anyway, I think it's good. I like that, right? As opposed to, and I drink a lot of milk, and I'm happy right now still to pay my Canadian farmers. I don't know. We will see about whether they need to have that much. That makes it we don't get to have as much cheese is the problem. But anyway, but I'm very happy to have my bag of Canadian milk, and everything like that. But the question is whether or not. So certainly the people are I think who are voting for Trump. He said that kind of rhetoric that he is in favor of doing that. Whether or not he actually is any support or help to any of those people is another matter, right? And so what I would suggest that actually has happened, his supporters largely, there's some cases are those out-of-work factory workers in Detroit, but in a lot of cases what it is people all across the rural-most component of the United States, where they're in the farming country and things like that, where Trump's tariffs and, for example, pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, having a trade war with China where China comes back and just devastates the American farmers and farm country. That's also, we shouldn't tell them out loud, but anyway, that's also been obviously really good for Canadian farmers, where we've been able to, triple pork production because all the pork in Iowa has to be, go fallow because it's not being bought by. And same thing, Brazil has been able to double soy production or whatever because the Chinese are buying all the Brazilian soy, anyway, because of China having this fight. So in that sense, I would say they're making that choice and they've made that rhetoric, but it isn't actually being helpful.
I noticed one of your last slides showed how Irish and Eastern and Southern Europeans were sort of on the periphery of American culture, and were then only fully accepted as white enemy. A new group came in who was less desirable to the American image. I guess my question is: are there other examples of that you can think of through history, like where a shift focuses a focus shifts so drastically and quickly. For example, like if the Holocaust had immediately or been just for Armenians, and then they're like, oh no, we've got a bigger problem with the Jews. Let's leave this one group alone and shift to them.
No, I think that I think that change. Do you have an example that you wanted to give? Okay, well then over there. So I think that's not unusual at all, probably. And so one of the things that happened here, I mean, so this caused, when we're showing this thing, it seems crazy or silly that Americans had the same xenophobia for Irish people, and it's almost brought up as a joke, but it was quite real at the time. And so what had happened was there's vastly more people of Irish descent in the United States than there are in Ireland. So when the famine happened, just the bulk of the whole population really emigrated. They had to, or died. Several died, and so several million. And so the people in Ireland's population didn't recover to the pre-famine levels. Who were actually living on the island, I think, until quite recently. It only started, and it always has had a net migration out. And so if you think about things like, ancient 13 colonies like Massachusetts, and if you look at the demographics of it, it's like largely a Catholic center. When you think of Boston as having, this kind of accent and being all these people named Kennedy, all these Irish people. So there was a vast, shift that happened. It's just that over time, people got over it, or white people in the United States got over this massive demographic shift that actually did happen in the 19th century, where Irish immigrants displaced, huge amount of the preceding Protestant colonists that had already been settlers there. In terms of other kind of examples of that in history, do you have one, Shaheen?
I have a couple.
Okay.
So one example that I think of is so a lot of Jews in the U.S. So they used to be more aligned with left parties, like right up until the 1960s. They were very much on the edge of like pushing the envelope. You look at Betty Friedan, you look at all these people who just pushed the envelope, and a lot of them were Jewish, right? Whether they were in Hollywood or in other areas. And now you look, and when you look at a lot of, I wouldn't say that it's like all majority of the Jewish population in the United States is conservative now, but a large part of it is, because in response to, Mexicans and Muslims, and they're considered more of an in-group, right? And another example would be in the UK. If you look at second or third generation South Asians who are part of the Conservative Party and are very anti-immigrant, and it makes no sense.
Yeah. Well,
like, we don't want immigrants. We're like, but.
Well, there's a tendency that's quite frequent, which is last one in, close the door, right? Yeah. And so we made it in. You people, you're not allowed in anymore, right? So that does occur as well. You had also.
Yeah, so just a random story related to the Irish question in U.S. history, and then I'll get to my question. So I'm from the United States, just visiting Toronto here for context. But I had a friend in high school named Jared Neal, but you go back a couple of generations and his last name was actually O'Neill, but then they changed it to make it less Irish so they could try and assimilate and avoid some of the prejudice against them. So there's still lingering impact from that, although now Irish are considered white in this constructed identity that we've made. But getting to my question, I was just thinking about kind of these competing national stories that you bring up for the United States, and also thinking about the different stories that people tell themselves about Brexit, and it kind of is along the same lines of questions that have been asked, but maybe I'll ask it in a somewhat different way, which is thinking about nationalism rearing its head so many times over history and how it played out in different contexts. Is there anything that you can think of that maybe we can learn from historical examples in the current context of how we can help this go right? That we have the opposing examples you mentioned of Nazi Germany, where things went just absolutely catastrophically bad, and then things went more positively with Gandhi and India gaining its independence from Britain. So I guess the
although again, it opened the whole thing to partition.
I'm going to say more positively. There's definitely a lot of baggage there too.
Than the Holocaust, better than that.
You can use the founding of the United States and saying, well, there were some positive things, but they screwed up really badly in other ways and preserved slavery for a long time, and we're still having lingering impact from that. But since it looks like nationalism's here to stay, at least for the short term, the genie's out of the bottle, is there anything we can learn from the historical examples in trying to make that work better, given that we're stuck with it in the United States and Britain and elsewhere?
Well, I'm hopeful, in terms of the overall course of the history of nativism in the U.S., that it has been generally true that whereas nativism comes back again and again and again, and so this nativism that was really present for, the Irish and this kind of a thing, that when like a party like the American Party, in the middle of the 19th century, they called themselves the Know-Nothings because they didn't want to admit they know nothing about what their platform was. It's an America First party, though they know that. But anyway, they didn't want to say, because we're the racist party here, and so we know nothing about what our anyway. So in terms of doing that, it's the good part of it is that there's a reaction against it, and so. Because the majority of, in that case, of the people were kind of disgusted by an ideology that is exclusionary and nativistic, and so in generally the parties, since it's a two-party system, both parties have tried to avoid, becoming entrapped in nativism, and there's all sorts of, let's say, never Trumpers, these pundits who are longtime Republicans, longtime conservatives, who warn again and again and again that the Republican Party in going down this path is essentially cementing its feet in galoshes and has jumped over the ship to follow Trump. Because the demographics are going to continue to go this particular way, and if you look at the proportion of people who are under 30 who support the Republican Party, it's pretty scary for anybody who, anyway, is looking forward to a long future of an institution like that. So hopefully that's the case. And in the past, for example, in Canada, that was like somewhat taken off the shelf in that the parties have at least generally committed to multiculturalism, both even the conservative or not, as a way, because otherwise there's too many people that you're not appealing to. So if the Conservative Party in Canada were to decide suddenly that it really hated all people who are South Asian, that would really put a crimp in their "we don't like French people" policy, because there's not enough to make an electoral majority, right? And so. So there's some demographic things that hopefully are in North America anyway preventing that. And looking forward in terms of the future for the poor people in the United Kingdom. They haven't actually exited yet, although who knows? So if it's going to happen in a hard, horrible way very soon. But if so, the problem for them is that the nostalgia of British Empire economically. Is just totally evaporated. Here we are in the Commonwealth, in the component of the British Empire that is absolutely the closest to the UK. Canada fought, in World War II under, under the British flag, or at least with the jack that had the Union Jack on it, an ensign that had the Union Jack on it, and yet. What?
The red ensign.
The red ensign, yeah, the red ensign, and yet, if you look at even like the proportion of Canada's economy, that is involving like exports and imports from the United Kingdom, and it's in a handful of percent, and so whereas all of Britain's economy is intertwined with the European Union, and they're in the situation where London has been like the financial capital of the whole thing, and so it's crazy time to have gone, in my opinion, to have gone down this path, and obviously all the young people in Britain, or a big proportion of them, agree, but unfortunately they weren't in the driver's seat of a referendum that could have permanent results, but it's hard to know.
John, I believe there's a question from.
Yeah.
One of the online participants.
Yeah,
I don't want to end the discussion here, but we can
We'll do this
continue
one,
the
and then one,
discussion,
and then one more, and then we'll,
continue
because
the
we have
discussion
been going
in
on
the
a long
other
time, and
room
we'll continue
with
the other.
snacks.
Okay, so I'll do this one, and then we'll continue offline. How's that? Okay, that's a good idea. Okay, the question, thank you, is how often is nationalism caused by people being oppressed? They are conquered, and then they band together to find identity again. How much of language around its all white males who have oppressed and hurt us is actually creating a national movement within the United States? Okay. So it's pretty interesting that in a lot of cases, like a conquest or a disruption can have very unexpected results. And so, for example, when the Germanic tribes overrun the Roman Empire, this actually causes a bizarre amount of Romanization. You might think that when the Roman Empire would be in charge, that everybody in Gaul would be speaking Latin and they would already be Christian. In fact, there's still lots and lots of Celts and Druids and pagans, and they're speaking all of their own kind of languages and things like that. And it's when the disruption of a foreign, people that have speaking a different language that you sort of like that suppresses it and kind of creates in reaction a national identity. And so it's a lot of times, weirdly, when the thing that's just lost power, it can actually happen later, assimilative effect. And so in that sense, when you're in a position where you're impressed, where there's a colonial power, that will often cause the people who are being colonized to both import ideas from the colonizer and then also to be awareness of the difference of themselves because they're made to be second-class citizens, from the colonizer. And so in those circumstances, I'd say it's very common for that to cause a nationality to emerge. And then, this is the second part here about the language around it's all white males who've been oppressed and hurt us is actually creating a national movement in the United States. So this idea that white males are being oppressed in the United States is something that I guess white males write to each other, but what you think on the internet, what you don't really understand. So what people will often say to me, so I met a guy when I was in Utah who was in a doctoral program at Harvard, actually, in the divinity school. And he was so upset that he doesn't feel that he's being able to openly talk to all the people in his program because he violently disagrees with the idea that there is such a thing as white male privilege, and so people are done listening to him, probably, because he keeps on bringing that up or something like that. And he says he doesn't have any such thing because he grew up in Utah as a poor person and they had nothing, and all this kind of a thing. And what that totally misunderstands is even the idea of structural privilege. So what you don't understand, from that, when you think, oh well, I had nothing to start out with, I've made my way. There's all kinds of people from every background who are born poor and who are struggling. And there's, like we were talking about before, with the person in Michigan who's lost their industrial job, the people in the rural areas for whom there are no potential jobs, at all. It's not that what privilege doesn't mean somebody's there giving you jobs. What it means is there are so many more societal structural things that are causing discrimination for people who aren't white, that there is that much more, not only just poverty, but that much more that you are having to face, everything from the kind of profiling where every single interaction you have in public, you have to, as a black person who's not if you're not staying within black ghetto, no matter how rich you are or what your education level, you have to constantly signal to all of the white people in the regular society that I belong here, It's okay, I'm one of the black people who you're allowed to let be out here, because otherwise you're immediately facing this discrimination of, why is black person in our place? You know, so this is what white privilege is, and it doesn't, and so for all of the white guys that are writing to each other that they're facing reverse discrimination and things like that, that's not what it's about. And so, anyway, so I don't think, so yes, I think that people have that sense of grievance, but it's misplaced, and so there is definitely problems in our society of income inequality, of lack of reasonable jobs, of everyone not being paid for living wages for fair work. I mean, I think that personally, I think that we need to, as a society, get to a place where if you need a person to do it, then you should pay the person in such a way that they have human dignity in order for them to do it. And we're going to have to somehow come to that as there's going to be in the future fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer things for people to do anyway, as more and more and more things are automated. So with that happy note, we'll say goodbye to everybody online, and thank everybody here for joining us. And